welcome to episode 24 of the David Bernard Podcast. Today is August 1st, 2022, and I am joined by none other than Fox 8 morning meteorologist Zach Fradella. Zach, we're flipping the calendar today. It's a new month, and we know that has significance as far as the hurricane season goes.
You know, every year it seems like we go through this whole, nothing's happening, and then we hit August, the calendar flips, and the season flips and becomes very active. I know a lot of people have been like, okay, they put out all these big numbers for this hurricane season. What's going to happen? Well, we'll see over the next few weeks because that's what's going to make up hurricane season this year.
I think one thing that was interesting, a friend was reminding me yesterday of 2019. Like, I can't even, that seems like 50 years ago. But in the 2019 season, we had Barry here in early July, and then nothing in the Atlantic until August 20th is when the sea storm formed, and we had 19 storms that year. So we had 17 storms form August 20th until the end of the season.
And looking at the long-range models, that might be the case this year. There's not much to speak of in the next 1 or 2 weeks, but we know it happens fast. This whole transition to, okay, nothing going on, so you have multiple waves out there. It happens quick in the middle to the end of the month. But if we want to meet those numbers that they put out, we need to get very hyperactive late August into September. But do note, La Nina years, we've talked about this whole La Nina thing, they can linger well into October and even in November in the Caribbean. Last year was a La Nina year, but it shut off after the middle of September. This year, that might be different.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that with our guest today, Gary Lisac, who I'll talk about in a minute, and some of the podcast fans that remember Gary from last year. But that shut off basically after Ida last year and a couple of big storms in the middle of the Atlantic was interesting, and it was kind of abrupt. Let's talk local here for this week. It doesn't look like we're going to have a tropical depression or a tropical storm, but we do have a feature in the atmosphere that could make things pretty wet.
Yeah, and I've talked about this the past few weeks, how we want it to be hot and dry at this time of year because that means we have a high pressure on us, and that's going to keep all the storms away. But we don't want it to be as wet and like it's going to be this week. It does look like a huge weakness developing over our area, and we've actually had rain over the past 12 days. A trace or more amounts at the airport 12 days in a row. Today would make it 13, and this week looks really wet. We could have multiple inches of rain when all is said and done, but we know how it works in the summer. If you get under a downpour, you're going to see street flooding, but usually it dies down before it ever becomes too terrible.
Yeah, it seems to be like it sort of peaks midday in this tropical regime and it dies down in the evening and starts back up in the morning. Well, on that note, and I referenced him a few minutes ago, we're going to bring on one of our most popular podcast guests from last year, my friend Gary Lezak. He is the Chief Meteorologist for the NBC affiliate in Kansas City, and he also has a private forecasting company known as Weather 2020. He was on episode 15 last August 12th, 2021, so about 2 weeks before Hurricane Ida. And I think one of the reasons it was so popular is because it's a hypothesis he has about super long-range forecasting, that the atmosphere actually behaves more predictably than we think. There's some things about the atmosphere we know are predictable, but in general, it's described as being chaotic and not an organized system. And his theory his hypothesis is known as the cycling pattern. But a number of years ago, he was doing a blog, and there's a lot of Gary blogger fans out there, and they said, let's not call it the cycling pattern hypothesis, let's call it the Lezak Recurring Cycle, or the LRC. So that's what it's become known as.
You know, I remember last year when we had him on, I was a skeptic. I really was. But over the past year, I've watched this whole LRC thing. I've followed along a lot closely, and there's definitely something to it. Now, to what exact extent you can determine a forecast out of it, that's the big question mark. But from a meteorological perspective, you could see the resemblances. And to kind of give a brief overview, what happened last October and November is what's actually happening right now. And we're in the last 2 months of this 2021-2022 LRC, and we're going to restart it again in October. But it does kind of give you that pathway throughout the year. It starts in October, it runs a certain length of time, and it comes all the way until the next end of September.
Yeah, you've definitely latched onto this. And I have to say, there have been some things that you've been able to predict weeks in advance. As long as you're in that cycle, right? We're going to talk more with Gary about it. What was the cycle this year? How long is it?
This year, it's on average, it's about 65 days, but it can go anywhere from about 62 to about 68. And that's the hard part of it, is figuring out when you recycle at the end of those 68 days, when we got to December, when you recycle, when does it happen? Because that's what determines what the next period of time is going to come around when you have a low pressure or a storm system along the Gulf Coast, or in this case, when you're in hurricane season, when are you going to get those tropical entities out over the Gulf?
And we're going to get into more about this with Gary, but when we say this cycle, just so everybody understands out there, when you say it's around 65 days, give or take, the pattern resets every 65 days across the northern hemisphere. So that's how you're able to see, oh, well, look what happened 3 cycles ago in the early part of the year, and then apply it to this time of the year as well. Gary will talk a little bit more about the cycle length, because it's different every year. If I'm wrong, correct me, but the cycle this year is a little unusually long.
It is longer than what because I've heard him talk about it, how this year is long. It's longer than normal, and it's harder to track when it's longer than normal, because we've only had about 4 sequences of this cycle to go through. If you have a 40 to 45, 50-day cycle, then it happens a lot more frequently throughout the year, so you can pinpoint certain storms that show up within the cycle.
Okay, the Lee Zack Recurring Cycle, part 2 of the podcast is on. Now Zach has been super educated on it, I should say, and I would say almost an expert in it, along with Eric Burris, who's the meteorologist in Orlando, who's worked with Gary on this, and I know Zach and Eric have been communicating back and forth. On that note, let's go ahead and bring in Gary Lisac. Gary, we meet again. It's been almost 1 year to the date since we last spoke with you. I have to say, we had a lot of response from our episode last year. In fact, it was our second most popular podcast, next to Jim Cantori. Sorry, but
my gosh. Well, Jim Cantori is quite famous, so I'll take second. I saw him up at the conference in Milwaukee, so he's a good guy.
Yeah, that was a real interesting one too, wasn't it? I had to get a picture of Jim's computer because we were trying to help him set something up, and he had like 7,000 tabs open on Chrome.
No way.
And I'm like, let's close about 6,000 of those, and then maybe we can resolve the issue.
I've seen some people that do that. When I get about 10 tabs, I'm embarrassed.
Yeah. Anyway, well, it just FYI, it can affect the response of your computer. Before we get too deep into this conversation today, because a lot of folks might not have heard our podcast last year, and by the way, it was episode 15 if you want to go look at it and listen to it. We have the audio and video version at fox8live.com/David. But we want to revisit your cycling pattern hypothesis, I guess as it's officially known. It's unofficially known as the Lezak Recurring Cycle, because back in the day, all your super fans, your blogger fans said, hey, let's give this a name after Gary. And so they named it the Lezak Recurring Cycle, or as it's known out there as the LRC. Maybe give us a Cliff Note version real quick of what it's about, and then we'll dive a little deeper.
Well, the weather pattern sets up every fall. So the pattern, by the way, is always cycling. And we're talking about the River Ver above us, between 10,000 and 50,000 feet up there in the troposphere, where all weather happens. There's a River Ver up there, and it's cycling regularly. So the LRC, or the cycling pattern hypothesis, describes that. Every fall, late September, early October, a brand new pattern will evolve and set up, and every year a cycle length develops. This year happens to be a very long cycle, and it took a while to figure that out, but it's been pretty consistent at about 9 weeks, 63 to 64 days. Every 9 weeks the pattern returns, and it's not just one day, it's the entire cycle that returns. So that's basically the gist of it. And if you know what the pattern is, you can make predictions. About 10 years ago, I stumbled across Hurricane Isaac, believe it or not. In 2012 was a drought year, and Isaac was heading towards the Gulf Coast, and it came in west of you and went straight up to Kansas City, where I'm at, and we needed some rain. It was a drought year. It was a very hot summer, and we utilized and used our knowledge of the cycling pattern to predict that it would actually, we knew that it had to go towards west west of western Louisiana and then turn north based on what we knew at the time about the cyclic pattern. So that's what it's all about. We stumbled across the hurricanes part of this, but the entire weather pattern above us is cycling regularly, and it gives us a chance to predict everything weather, not just tropics.
Now, to give some context to that, because you specifically called out Isaac, okay? Everybody in Louisiana knows about Isaac 2012. So Isaac was in the summer/fall or going into the fall of 2012, but it was what happened in 2011. And that fall, that's the LRC cycle that created that, right? And when you start to do this, when you start to figure out, like you mentioned, hurricanes are kind of how you stumbled upon this, but what other weather, what else can you figure out from the LRC cycling?
Well, Zach, let's just do an example of this season. Just now, the Kentucky disaster, we had 28 people at least apparently that are killed by this horrific flood. The LRC would not predict that there's going to be a horrific flood, but it did predict the model. We have a model, and it did predict that there would be a high precipitation event, not just in eastern Kentucky, but also in eastern Missouri, where St. Louis had the flooding a few days earlier. That week was predicted to be a very active week. But the pattern that's set up last fall is continuing now. So Mayfield, Kentucky had a tornado on December the 10th, and they had 56 people killed by that tornado. Sharon Springs, Kansas had a tornado in early October, around October 12th when the pattern set up. What are the odds that Mayfield, Kentucky gets hit by a second tornado, maybe 200 years from now, or in this pattern, maybe this year? And Mayfield, Kentucky had another tornado. The first one was an EF4 that caused the damage and devastation and deaths. The second one, right on schedule, around April 13th, Mayfield, Kentucky got hit again, and we predicted that it would happen. I didn't expect to see the tornado in Mayfield, Kentucky again. I did look for that. The first target would be Mayfield. Sharon Springs, Kansas, on October 12th, they get hit by a tornado. They're a town that is 5 blocks by 10 blocks, a small little town. That town might get hit by another tornado in 500 years, 1,000 years from now. The odds are so low that that little town gets hit by another tornado. However, on April 23rd, Sharon Springs, Kansas got hit by a second tornado. 2 tornadoes there, 2 tornadoes in Mayfield. It doesn't mean every single time you have a tornado, you're going to have a tornado again. But the conditions that produced it will cycle back through, and you're going to be the number one target if you got hit by a tornado. It might be 2 counties away, or it might be a large hailstorm and not a tornado. But the odds are this year's pattern is going to produce that. So you look for these things in the fall, hurricane season, you get these indications, and then you can project to the next hurricane season and predict what's going to happen.
We're going to get into hurricanes in a little more detail, Gary, but it's interesting when you talk about the cycle, and it's around a 65-day cycle this year. Every year the cycle is different on when we expect the pattern to repeat. Okay, so I'm going to get you to explain what determines the length of that cycle, but also we're getting into a tricky time of the year, right? As you get into August and especially September, right before the cycle is supposed to reset, and I'll let you explain that, maybe it gets a little more muddied on what's going to happen. Why don't you go ahead and explain to everybody, first of all, how you determine the pattern repetition cycle each year, how many days it is between?
I can't tell you that. That's proprietary information.
Well, yeah, come on, Gary. You want me to? I'll tell you what you told me.
I know. I mean, it is, but it's a really complex thing that I've been trying to give away for 30 plus years now, and it's very challenging. It's a big puzzle in the atmosphere. But when the pattern sets up in October and November, there's an art to it. It's science. There's no doubt about it. It's science, and that's how the model that I have that is science, and it predicts the forecast months ahead of time is going to be accurate. But there's an art to it, and I'm sure Zach, that's been showing you some of these examples. And then, David, you have to train your eye. You're beginning to see, these patterns like, holy moly, it does look like that pattern from 64 days ago. That's ridiculous. Okay, so but it's not ridiculous. It's not a coincidence. Patterns cycle regularly. So when you have the pattern in October, November, it sets up. It's a brand new pattern. It's a pattern that has never happened before. That makes it challenging. Oh, there might be a similar pattern 50 years ago, 20 years ago, or last year, but it will be a unique pattern. There's different things that happen. And then you look for the repeat, and there's an art to it. And this year, it just happened to be 64 days later or so, and there it was. And then you validate and verify that. What?
No, I mean, I'm just gonna, because everyone out there is like listening, going, I'm just gonna give the bare bones of it. You've talked about it in a previous podcast. There's an astronomical attachment to this, you believe, which has to do with when the sun sets at the North Pole, hence October and November. Believe me, I don't want you to explain it anything more beyond that, because I probably won't be able to follow it, and no one else will. But that's just why there's this reset in October, November. You think that there is some relationship between the sun setting at the pole and the pattern recycling.
I was, Zach, I was literally with a friend trying to show me something new in the LRC, and I think he's onto something, and I'm going to really go in deep into that by early next year. We'll talk about it, because I think we can find the cycle a little bit earlier based on this technique that he showed me. But for the first 30 minutes, he was showing me these maps, and I was like, just like you guys, it's like, what? No way. This isn't possible.
Okay,
And I thought,
so
this must be what people say when they watch me try to explain it to them. So I waited about 30 minutes into it. I was like, oh, I got it.
So, okay, all right, being a newbie, I've done this for just a year now. I've only gone through one cycle, and like you said, this has been one of the hardest cycles we've had because it's so long. But that has been the hardest thing for me to figure out, like when you're trying to project things long term, until you get in the next cycle. When I say that, I mean, okay, what happened in October, November started repeating. Until you get in that new repetition, you don't know how many days it is. And even once you keep going into spring and you know how many days it is, it's not exactly 62 or exactly 63. It changes, and that throws your storm systems off in the long range. How do you get around something like that?
Because it really is more ordered than you think, Zach. It really is close to that 9 weeks, 63, 64 days this year. It's almost, that is like a number, and you can calculate it. I can show you a little bit more how to do that, but it oscillates. It's a river up there, and there could be a big, huge storm that forms, and like Superstorm Sandy in that same 2012 season, later in that year, Superstorm Sandy was a big, huge superstorm. It's like a big boulder in the river of air, and it seems like that will slow down the whole pattern, but then when that gets pushed out, it all catches up again. So it's still close to that number.
Does it oscillate in the midst of it? Say you had your Kentucky tornado. Could it miss a few days later or come a little few days early? Have you seen that continuously in all the research?
Yeah, it can. The Mayfield, Kentucky tornado was about a day early, okay, 2 days early. But if you're predicting and you're predicting like this week, there's going to be a chance of a major tornado outbreak, or there's going to be a chance of Hurricane Ida coming into Louisiana, you're going to get that week down pretty good. And I think you can get down to a specific date. I did it when I first started looking forward and predicting in the Super Bowl, outdoor Super Bowl that Roger Goodell decided to do in East Rutherford, New Jersey. Major event outside. Seattle's going to play Denver, the Broncos, against the Seahawks. The Seahawks ended up beating Denver that day. And that year cycle happened to be a 58-day cycle, 57 to 58 days. And maybe it's 58 to 59 days. Right at 58 to 59 days. As soon as I identified that cycle, okay, we can put this forecast out there. And I said, it's not going to snow. It may snow a day or two later. So we're really going to get specific. And it's going to warm up into the 50s leading into the game. All of the forecasts, AccuWeather, all these other forecasts that came out predicted major, the GFS, Arctic outbreak. And I slept easy at night because I knew the GFS was wrong. The European model was wrong. Major Arctic outbreak because, like you showed, David, the other day, that when we looked at the weather pattern, I knew that it was the exact opposite of what that GFS showed. And when it came down within 3 days, 4 days, the GFS was wrong, the European model was wrong, and it was 55 degrees the day of that Super Bowl. It snowed the
And
next day. It snowed the next
I've,
day. I got unlucky.
and I've mentioned to David how that's where I find it so valuable of information is when the long range models are coming out and you know what the LRC is supposed to be, you can know when the models get it wrong. And that's a great example that you just provided right there.
You know when the models are right, you know the models are wrong. Like this year, and we haven't gotten into our hurricane forecast or what we're seeing, but we'll get to that. But let me tell you, the GFS has been on steroids. Something weird about the GFS. It's predicted at least a dozen or 15 hurricanes already. There's been not one.
Yep.
There have been several times over the past year where Zach will say, hey, we're at this point in the cycle. Look what the jet stream was doing back in January. Here we are at that same point in the cycle. And I have to tell you, it's been a number of times, not just once or twice, that the upper air pattern is almost identical. Now, as you were mentioning that Arctic outbreak, in January, and we'll talk about this more once we get into the hurricane portion of this, is that just because the pattern repeats doesn't mean you're going to get the same exact type of weather. It might be severe weather, but maybe it's not that bad of an outbreak. Maybe there's just some ingredient there that's missing that doesn't make it as severe, right? Or maybe there is a disturbance there in the Gulf. This time it's a Category 3. Last time it was maybe a week low or something like that. So
David, it's good. I've got this. It's a pay account, but you can get on there for free. And I think I did this Hurricane Outlook that included some of that. But you go weather2020. My phone's going off in the other room. weather2020.substack.com. Can you hear that phone?
No, barely. It's fine, Gary. This is like podcast land. Like anything goes.
I know. So, but anyway, weather2020.substack.com. And on there, I showed how the January pattern, January 13th, was directly related to July 24th. 192 days apart, 64 times 3 day cycle, and this same pattern. But in January, you're going to have a blizzard and an Arctic blast, but in July, you're not going to have a blizzard and an Arctic blast. To answer your question, the same pattern will definitely show different results when you just look at January and July. Now, when there's a major winter storm in November and December, and you identify the cycle length and you look for a February part of that pattern, it's more likely to be similar to what had happened in the next cycle. But yeah, the spring version, the summer version, like that's why hurricane season begins in October and November. Next hurricane season will begin in October and November and go dormant and then resurface in May or June.
What was interesting was that July 24th, I was in the Northeast over the past week or so. That was the big trough that came through, I believe, right? Yeah, and there was some severe weather, and they had tornado warnings in northern Maine.
If you look at severe weather reports, they're cycling. I mean, almost the biggest outbreaks are right on schedule all the time, every year.
We've been tiptoeing around it. It's August 1st. You're talking to a large audience, mostly on the Gulf Coast, but we've got people scattered about here and there. Obviously, we're concerned about hurricane season. I mean, we've been through hell the last 2 years, and really the entire Gulf of Mexico. If you start up with Harvey to Michael and then back to everything that's impacted Louisiana, it's been hard the last 4 or 5 years, and so. We definitely could use a break. Now, Zach, I was going to have you, I'm just going to go ahead and mention this, Zach, and I think it's what you were referencing on your website, Gary, is the Barcelona site with the hurricane predictions. Okay, and so, is that what you have on your website? Can you see all the predictions? Or I was going to give folks the other, okay, so what is it again? Give us your website again.
That site's down for about 4 days right now.
Okay.
So they just took it down for some kind of maintenance. But
the one I'm about to talk about, the bar. Okay. Anyway, it's also linked through Colorado State University's Tropical Meteorology Project and Phil Klotzbach. But the bottom line is, and we look at this every year, this website has taken all the private and public companies, universities, the government, Weather 2020, private company like yours, Gary, and they've put their tropical predictions on there. And they break it down by how many major hurricanes are they predicting, how many hurricanes are they predicting, tropical storms, and then overall named storms. But I think most importantly, they also put down what the ACE prediction is, accumulated cyclone energy. And that's really the best way, because naming a storm can be, there's some subjectivity there, but the ACE really tells a story of how powerful these storms are. And your company, Weather 2020, and if you look at ACE, that's where you can really see it, you're calling for ACE to be near or slightly below normal, which is not anything compared with at least 95% of the other companies I've seen out there predicting that. Why?
2 years ago, as you guys experienced, we predicted, Nicholas and Claudette and Ida and all those that impacted your region significantly. This year, as soon as it hit October 5th, poof, first time in years, hurricane season went over, ended, nothing. That's the first sign that it's the new LRC is setting up. That's the first sign that, oh my gosh, what happened? Well, the new LRC set up. And poof, the year before, you had Eta and Delta and Zeta and all these that happened. And then those returned as Nicholas and Claudette and Ida, okay? This year, there's nothing. So that's the first indication that the ACE score will be low, because there aren't many systems. And here we are, August the 1st, and there has been Alex that was backwards. Alex came from the Pacific Ocean. It crossed Central America, moved into the Caribbean, into the Gulf of Mexico. For some reason, the National Hurricane Center has decided not to call these depressions this year. I don't get it, but potential tropical storm for days. And there's a reason for that, because it causes maybe more urgency, okay? But no depression, potential tropical storm. Alex was not a tropical storm, went all the way across the Gulf of Mexico. Warm water or no warm water, you still need conditions besides just warm water to cause a hurricane to form. Otherwise, we'd have hurricanes all the time, but we don't. So that moved rapidly east, which is backwards. They're supposed to move west. I know that was early in the season, but it moved east across Florida, finally formed into a tropical storm, and then became subtropical storm Alex. Then you had Bonnie. Bonnie moved into the central part of Central America, right near Nicaragua. It was barely a tropical storm as it came inland, and is for a day it was tropical storm Bonnie. And then Colin was sort of made up by the National Hurricane Center. I'm just saying, it formed over land. Tropical storms don't form over land. They can, okay? But come on. After Tropical Storm Colin formed, it moved out over the Atlantic and died as soon as it hit the water. Anyway.
Okay.
Those are the three systems we've had so far. I don't know. I'm sorry I went there. I just had to go.
So what? So what is your? So what the point? I think you were getting back to a point.
Thank you for getting me back on target.
Yeah, I mean the point being that we had this, and I think one thing we should mention, when we had the dramatic shutdown of the season last year, it was unusual also in the sense that we've had this major La Nina going. Which typically the year before the storms, they kept, in 2020, the storms kept just churning out well into November. And I think it was Iota, was a powerful Category 4, Eta, all of these. And so, why, despite these continuing supposed favorable conditions, did things shut off so quick? And what does that mean now going forward this year?
And to piggyback on what David's saying real quick is, okay, we know the shutdown happened with the new LRC. When you make your seasonal forecast, do you take anything else into account, like another La Nina's rolling on? Do you see anything else go into that?
Yeah, La Nina is important, obviously. Conditions are more likely to have less shear, more obvious potential for hurricanes. So it's still La Nina now. It's minus 0.7. I just looked real quick. minus zero point 0.7 on the latest update today. So it's technically a continuation of the La Nina that has existed for the last couple of years almost. And we're going into possibly a third La Nina winter coming up, although it's forecast to go to neutral by wintertime or so. So we are in La Nina. Sometimes the third La Nina, if you look at La Ninas, it is usually a little bit quieter for some reason. Don't know the answer to that completely. But La Nina is one factor. Obviously, the sea surface temperatures are a factor, but the LRC is the biggest factor. Okay, I know it's a new technology. I've been working on it for 38 years. Before me, Jerome Namias in the 1940s and 50s, he wrote many papers on the index cycle and how by November there's enough information to know what's going to happen the following winter. And he said these cycles last weeks at a time, and he just never figured out that they completely repeat over and over again. But the LRC is definitely the biggest reason. And this season, it went quiet in October and November. Now, there's a couple systems we're concerned with, so we can talk about that, but there are other factors besides La Nina. But La Nina is a big one.
Let's talk about a couple of those systems.
Okay. Let's do it. Okay, I'm looking at this one chart. I can send it to you, but I've been analyzing it. October 15th and 16th, and this is in the first cycle of the LRC. There was what I call a tropical disturbance right near South Cuba on October 15th and October 16th. 63 days later, on December 17th, there was another system that was right near the southeast part of Cuba, near Hispaniola, on December 17th and December 18th. 128 days after that, which is 64 times 2, there was another system right over southwest Cuba and right over Cuba on April 24th and 25th. So while there's a severe weather outbreak going on, there are these systems in the tropics that are also right on the LRC cycle. And then we go to the last cycle, June 27th and June 28th. There was a system over the Bahamas on June 27th. Remember, everything has been going backwards this year, which makes this system suspect too, except for one thing. And it's over South Cuba on June 28th. So when is that due back? Around September 1st, okay?
Labor Day.
So Labor Day, but it could be as early as August. It could be as early as August 22nd, because a few days before we had another system that was there. And as we all know, those of you that have been really interested in following tropics for years, we know that if a tropical storm does form and it forms into a big hurricane, there's not going to be another tropical storm or hurricane right next to it. If it does, they'll do the Fujirama or whatever you call that thing. And but more likely within that date range, August 22nd to September 3rd. 5 cycles we've had so far. We've been in 5 cycles. You can see my hand, 5. Okay, and 4 out of the 5 had this indication, which means there's an 80% chance it will be there during near peak hurricane season. So far this season, we haven't had evidence of strong development. So I'm expecting one there. Will it be a major hurricane? Once it forms, then you look at the LRC, where is it going to track? Most likely, it would then track northwest towards the southern Florida peninsula. A slight chance it tracks northwest into the Gulf. I've made a mistake before. I'm like, oh, it's not going to move northwest or west into the Gulf of Mexico. But we all know how systems usually track at the end of August and early September. They often do track northwest. So even though I see a favored track towards Florida, for you guys, you still have to watch to see if it could enter the Gulf of Mexico in that time frame. There's one other one in mid-September that is the secondary one that also could affect the area, but it went backwards. In the previous cycles, it moved from west to east across North Florida. It would form near Louisiana and then move east. So, but most likely, you guys, you have a lower threat this season in Louisiana, and it wouldn't shock me if there was not one landfalling storm or one major threat. But if there is one, it's that August 22nd to September 3rd time frame.
From your lips, Gary, we're going to go with that. Now, Zach, you were going to get into this, but I mean, I've known Gary longer. You're talking about all these storms, all right? And we've had, I don't even remember how many storms we had last year, the year before. 19 in 2019, record number in 2020, all of those. Some folks will say, and by the way, we can talk. You gave a talk earlier this summer at the American Meteorological Society's Broadcast Meteorology Conference up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Sorry, I could not make it. I wish I could have been there for that. But let's be honest, a lot of our colleagues are skeptical of this. One thing I find is that not just with meteorology, but anything related to science, that usually when people are sort of out there on a limb, so to speak, or out there on their own, it's easier to criticize that one person and kind of tap down what we already know, right? Because sometimes people are more comfortable with what they know and what they don't know. And so some folks say, like, well, he kind of cherry picks these events. He's picking out the ones that work, but he can't explain, B, C, and D, but he has one for A. What do you say to your critics about that?
I think Zach would agree. I'll ask Zach, but I think we can explain A, B, C, D, and E. Maybe not F or G, but 5 out of the 7. It's not cherry picking at all. And we since before 2014, I used to look back. Don't you see this looks the same? Don't you see this looks the same? Don't you see this looks the same? Beginning with that Super Bowl prediction, accurately predicted. That was one, but then we predicted the Masters golf tournament that year for it to rain in the early rounds, washed out the early rounds of that golf tournament. But the entire pattern is cycling. There's no cherry picking at all. And it's a lot of pressure. It's a lot of pressure to predict the weather for any of us, any of you meteorologists out there trying to predict the weather for an event 3 days from now. There's a lot of pressure on us to get it right. How about one 50 days out and I have to worry about it for 50 straight days? Gary England, the famous meteorologist in Oklahoma, he's doing fantastic. He's retired for quite a few years now. I stay in touch with him.
He retweeted me the other day. I was like, hey, Gary's still out there.
I know. I'm so glad to see that. But I talked to him every few months or so. But he's doing great. But he's like, Lezak. Call me Lezak for some reason. So I worked with him. He was my mentor. But he's like, this is too stressful. I can't take this day by day. trying to get this in. But then it ended up being right.
I can totally understand what you're saying, because I've thrown some of these calendars out there, and you sit there. It's not only 50 days. You're 50 days. It's 50 nights too, because it's hard to sleep when you're forecasting something that far, and you're like, it's not showing up on the models yet, and then in the end, it's pretty close.
Yeah, let's talk about that. Zach, I think you should go back and put some of your LRC calendars you made earlier this year, on Facebook or whatever, and maybe do another explanation for it. You also did a Tracking the Science segment about it. I think it's great, Gary, what you've been working on for so long. I think anything that pushes the envelope to give us a better understanding of what's happening is definitely of a benefit. That's my opinion.
And David, I appreciate that, but you're learning a little bit more. It takes a while, and I pour my life into it, and it is groundbreaking. I'm 100% certain that hopefully I'm alive while this comes to fruition. I got some things to get it out there, because it's going to save lives. It will save lives. It will help businesses, and it's going to be impacting. But it's tough for our peers. They want peer-reviewed papers. Well, I've got one. It's called the Cycling Patterns of the Northern Hemisphere. You can go read that. And it was published and peer-reviewed. And I've got an article in Meteorological Technology International Magazine which showed how we predicted Gordon. I predicted that 9 months before at a conference in front of everyone, in front of our peers. So, yes, it seems out there, but what new discovery isn't out there? It'll be commonplace years from now. Just right now, I'm trying to bring it to the market.
All right. Well, Gary, it has been great talking with you again, even if it's August 1st. And I can't believe we're only a month away from the 1-year anniversary of Ida. We're tired here along the Gulf Coast. We're beat up. We're battered. And so we're going to roll with, I won't say your predictions, but cross fingers that our impact chances might be a little bit lower this season. But everybody along the Gulf Coast knows how the game's played. there can always be something that sneaks in from somewhere, and we got to be ready. So other than that, how's Kansas City? You guys still frying up there, or?
Well, it hasn't been that hot here. It was just 1 degree above average in July. Believe it or not, the extreme heat was Oklahoma, southern Kansas, Texas. So we just barely avoided it, which is fantastic. But yeah, we'll track that August 22nd to September 3rd system. Let's hope it doesn't develop and track towards you, because I want you guys to have a calmer season.
We need it. All right, Gary Lisac, thanks a lot for being on the podcast today.
All right, Zach, send me an email and we'll talk.
We'll do.
As usual, an interesting and animated conversation with Gary Lisac. He's been a friend of mine for decades, and I respect him a lot. And the one thing I want to say about the LRC and his hypothesis is that, and what I like about it, is not the hypothesis itself, but here you are, you have somebody, and there's many scientists like this across the country that are constantly looking at new ideas, pushing the envelope of what is possible to better understand why our atmosphere behaves the way it does. Will we ever get to a day when we can completely control the weather? That's way beyond my ability to even process at this point in time, but certainly we've come a long way in the last 60 or 70 years in understanding the Earth's atmospheric circulations.
And I totally agree with you, David, on that. It's like, we can get so bogged down and just, okay, well, the models are wrong and stuff like that. Having something else in your repertoire to figure out what the pattern is, and that's kind of the big thing with the LRC. When I'm looking at the models in the 7 to even upwards of 14 days out, and it doesn't agree with what the LRC cycle's saying, that's when I say the models probably have it wrong. And more times than not this year, since I've been following it just for 1 year now, it was like that, where, okay, then they finally got the clue of what it should have been. So, like you said, being able to push the envelope and help us in any kind of way with forecasting, not only the big hurricanes, but just the generic weather pattern, that's where the stuff benefits us, and it's going to continue to benefit us as we move forward.
Yeah, and I think definitely as scientists, as broadcast meteorologists, it helps in our preparation of what can be ahead. Obviously, once we actually, get a storm forming, there's some kind of threat. We're going to be back to just the meat and potatoes, as you said, of the computer guidance once they have a fixed system and what we think is going to happen with the storm based on experience.
And we know it's coming. We're going to have storms out there. Now, whether any of them come to the Gulf, that's a different story, but it's going to get active, and we'll be paying attention.
We're going to be paying attention, Zach, but more than ever, we need a break along the Louisiana Gulf Coast and the Mississippi Gulf Coast. Well, pretty much the entire Gulf Coast for that matter. Now that I think back to the last 3 or 4 years, going all the way back to storms
Michael.
like Harvey and Michael. So yeah, it has been a rough run for the Gulf of Mexico. For Zach Fradella, I'm David Bernard. Thanks for listening to our podcast. You can also watch it at fox8live.com/David, and you can listen to it by just searching for the David Bernard Podcast on Spotify or wherever you get your podcast apps. See you next time.